Hello, everybody. My name's Tim Mohin. I'm so pleased to be with you. It's a little bit early in the morning for me, so just a warning, it's about 1 o'clock in the morning here. So I'll try to keep myself on track, but I'm sure Elaine will keep me straight if I stray off the beaten track. It is such a pleasure to be back with you. I wish we could be in person and eat some of the wonderful delicacies that we're familiar with in Singapore every time I've been there, which is, as you know, many times. It's so great to see so many friends, Esther, Lawrence, Rajesh, and others who have been with us many times in this event. And welcome to all the participants that, again, I miss seeing you in person. And let's hope that next year we'll be able to see each other all again. But wow, have things changed since we have been together. I will just say, as sort of an editorial remark to begin my comments, I've been in this business now 35 years, believe it or not. It's a very, very long time. But I started in the world of sustainability before we had the word sustainability. It was environmental protection back then. And we were really focused on command and control regulation and that kind of thing. Over those many, many years, the world changed. Companies got out in front of regulations and started moving more quickly and wanted to protect people and the planet. That gave birth to sort of the corporate sustainability movement, if you will, which really started to be transparent and report on all of the various things that companies are doing to protect the environment, to protect people. And that has been the practice for many, many years now. As people know, I ran the Global Reporting Initiative for several years. And during that time, GRI, and it is still the case today, became the largest by adoption rate sustainability reporting standard of all the various standards out there. But one thing that we always tried to do, and I think is actually happening now, is to consolidate all the many, many standards and frameworks that are out there so that there could be consistency. And with consistency, we get comparability. And with comparability, we get progress. Well, I'm really happy to say that that is starting to happen now. You heard the opening remarks that Glasgow changed everything. I was in Glasgow for the COP26 meeting, which was really, really incredible. But when you really take a step back and look at the climate meetings, and there's been 26 of them, we have a lot of promises. Companies, nation states, financial institutions increasingly are all coming together to say, we want to help the climate, which is wonderful, but they basically set an aspiration to do so. The only way we're going to make those aspirations come true is with good accounting and disclosure. Sounds fairly boring to a lot of people, but I know this audience gets it. And that is actually what is happening. And I think it's being driven by the climate movement right now. I think it's going to get bigger than that. So my task here with you today is to really talk about what's new and what is going to happen next. And to stay with the cooking theme, it's kind of like I've been trying to bake this cake for 35 years. It's in the oven, and I think it's just about done. And boy, does it smell good. Things have changed, and they've changed for the better. So I know you've heard this already in this conference today and probably yesterday as well. But the big news is that consolidation, harmonization is here. So the International Financial Reporting Standards, the IFRS, announced their new International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB. So some new abbreviations for you. If we didn't have enough to confuse everybody, now we have two new ones that everybody has to keep track of. Gratefully, they are starting to consolidate a few of the other abbreviations into the new ISSB. So the Value Reporting Foundation, which included SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and the International Integrated Reporting Coalition, the IIRC, those are all combined now, and they're being combined into the new International Sustainability Standards Board, as is the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. So you're taking a few of the confusing mix and you're placing them all in this new group. What's really powerful, though, about the International Sustainability Standards Board is that it comes from a group that already sets the financial reporting standards for most of the world. There's about 195, 197 countries in the world. Almost 150 of them use the IFRS standards right now to report on their financial results. So you can see where this is going. As sustainability, or what we call now ESG, has been mainstreamed, if you will, it's now going to be reported as part of your company's financial statements. That sounds not so big, but it's actually huge. It changes everything because 92% of the S&P 500 currently report sustainability information. This is not new. Companies have been doing this for 10, sometimes over 20 years. But I'm telling you that the old way of doing sustainability reporting is no longer going to cut it anymore. Because when sustainability information is incorporated into financial statements, it has to be audited, it has to be assured, and then it has to be integrated into those financial statements. Recently, I led an expert panel for the European Union as they're developing their new directive on sustainability reporting. And we started to talk about this issue of integration, auditing, and assurance. And I'm just going to tell you, there are many different hurdles, very, very technical, but very, very difficult hurdles to meet all of those requirements. For example, a lot of companies report their financial statements on a quarterly basis. How often do we do our sustainability information? Mostly annually. A lot of times companies are reporting their annual results 6 months after the end of the calendar year. That's not going to cut it anymore. Auditing and assurance is often not done. We're seeing 30, 40% of the reports that are done for sustainability being audited and assured. So there's some very basic things that are going to change. But the change is here already. So we're seeing two big factors across the world leading to this change. One is regulation, and the other is, as I've said, standards. Regulation has already taken place in the Great Britain, United Kingdom, has a regulation now that requires listed companies to report on climate disclosure. And that's also happening in Japan. It's also law in New Zealand. What we're going to see very, very quickly in several major economies is very similar laws. I'm sure you've talked about it. If you haven't already, you will today, about the European Union Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And in the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission is very close to issuing a new regulation, which will also require disclosure. One of the clarities that is really cuts through all of this is that we often use the term ESG or sustainability in terms of what is coming. We can kind of boil that down to climate change. I think that many people are sort of frustrated by that because we know that ESG, sustainability, is much broader than climate change. But as this field matures and as some of that information goes into the mainstream of financial disclosure, what has happened is climate change is at the top of everybody's list. Why is that? Because it is the most urgent and pressing problem in the world. My view is that is necessary but not sufficient. I think you'll see more ESG issues cross from the voluntary reporting space into this mandatory, integrated, audited, and assured space. But climate change is kind of the issue that is happening now. And it is already required in several major economies, and it will be required by more. The other big change is that it used to be choose your own adventure. So companies would basically say, through a materiality assessment, what is it we want to report on? And a lot of times they came up with different things. And those differences under the materiality assessment led to very different approaches, even for companies in the same sector, of how they reported what they reported. And so there was no comparability. And quality was kind of all over the map. The reason these regulations and standards are happening is to address those issues. And so what we're now going to see is universal disclosure for all companies in every sector. And the first one through that regulatory change is going to be climate change, as I mentioned before. So if you haven't been paying attention to these issues, it's time to start really paying attention, because these changes are coming very quickly, and they're going to affect company reports like they've never affected them before. And I think one of the big issues is that there's legal liability associated with these disclosures now that hasn't been there before. Typically with financial disclosure, the CFO, the CEO needs to sign off on what those statements are, and there's legal liability if those statements are incorrect. So major changes are coming. I think it's a very big deal. I think it's welcome, frankly, and I think all companies need to be paying attention to what's happening. There's one other thing I want to mention as we go forward here in these many changes that are coming, which is the question of financial materiality versus sustainability. As many people know, when I ran GRI, I was very focused on this issue of double materiality. And I think it really still is incredibly important. As all the changes that I just talked about sort of take shape, they're all based on this notion of financial materiality. And why is that? Finally, we've realized that climate change is financial risk. The TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, back in 2015, said that climate change has the ability to basically destabilize the global economy. Just recently, the Financial Stability Oversight Committee here in the United States said the same thing. And so it's very, very clear that climate change has reached that tipping point where now it's been integrated into the mainstream of disclosure. But as those people in this conference know, those people who've been around sustainability reporting for a long time, that's not the only issue. There are many, many issues that companies have been reporting on for years that are really impacts on people and the planet. Where are those issues going to go? Frankly, I think it's a very big question mark. So while this mainstreaming happens, while ESG has been integrated into financial statements, the regulatory changes that I'm talking about are also starting to look outside of a company's financial results and starting to incorporate some of these other issues. We're primarily seeing that in the European Union as they develop their new directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, focused on double materiality. What's very interesting with that directive, though, is they're also maintaining what I said earlier, which is integrated, audited, and assured universal disclosure. So all companies, every sector, going to have to report on climate change, first of all, but probably other issues as well, in their financial statements. That's a big change. But the European Union's going further than that and saying they're going to develop their own standards, mandated reporting, based on double materiality, meaning that it's not just the impact of the environment and other issues on the company's finances, but it's the impact of the company on the environment around them. They're the only legislative body that is actually going that way. But it's a very big change because the European Union, as many people know, regulate companies not just based in Europe, but companies that do business in Europe. So there's this large sort of extraterritorial effect that the European Union regulations will have. Here in the US, I think it's much more focused on financial materiality and climate change. But again, European Union is going much, much broader than that. The real question that I think a lot of people have is, will we just repeat the confusion that we have right now in disclosure? As the European Union moves forward with their new directive that I've talked about already, and as the IFRS moves forward with their international standards and more countries regulate based on those international standards, will we then have two different systems? There is a lot of talk right now about bringing them together. It's very, very positive talk. I think they can be related and work together, but we'll see. It's not a done deal yet. And I know that most people would be very, very excited if it was. In fact, recently there were 58 different companies across the European Union that wrote a letter. These 58 companies representing about 8 trillion of combined revenue said that unless we get it together, meaning consolidate these two sort of regulatory efforts that are somewhat on a collision course, they're not going to be very happy. So there's a lot moving. It's probably the most dynamic time I've ever seen in this business, and I'm super, super excited about it. The last thing I'll say, and then I'd love to get into some questions, is to focus on climate. It's very, very interesting that climate is at the top of everybody's list, and yet the actual accounting standards for climate are sort of a little shaky. We have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. We always talk about disclosure, but when you really dive down into the accounting standards, they've been developed not by financial auditors, not by financial standard setters, but by essentially environmental groups. And that has led to, I think, a little bit of a mismatch. And so it's very, very interesting that companies are now having to look at these auditing and accounting standards and say, how are we going to possibly take that into our financial statements? When you look at scope 3, the emissions outside of your control as a company, how are you going to basically assure that those scope 3 emissions are accurate before you put those into your financial statements? I think that's where a lot of people are concerned. The company I work for right now is basically moving into that space quite actively and creating what's called the ERP, the Enterprise Resource Planning Platform for carbon, basically treating carbon as a data problem and providing real-time information, auditable and assurable for large enterprises and financial services institutions. This is what is happening. This is where things are going. But let me just tell you, it is the most dynamic time I've ever seen in my many, many years of working on this space. So all companies need to be paying attention to these regulatory changes and being prepared for them. Again, I'm so happy to be with you guys again. It's been too long. I can't wait to come to Singapore again, and hopefully we will be in person next year when you have this event. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope there's some time left for some questions because, as everybody knows who I've talked to many times in Singapore, I love to get into some dialogue with folks. And I'll stop there. And again, thank you for the time.
Well, thank you, Executive Chef Tim. That was a fantastic overview of what's going on. And, you know, you were very clear, sort of super optimistic about all of these changes and the way things are going to all harmonize and hang together, and a reduction of all of these acronyms that we're used to. And, you know me, I'm the usual skeptic. And there's one word which I didn't hear you say, and it's the word that's after harmonization and comparability, which is, let's not go there, comparability and consistency and decision useful, there's one word that's on everybody's lips. I didn't hear you say it, and it's interoperability. That's what people are talking about. They're saying, hey, all of these standards are still going to exist. We're going to have SASB, we're going to have GRI, we're going to have the TCFD, we're going to have the European directive, we're going to have the World Economic Forum's stakeholder capitalism metrics, we're going to have all of this stuff. The difference is it's going to be interoperable. So they're going to use the same sort of terminologies and maybe some methodologies and maybe some alignment of the requirements. But it's still going to be a whole lot of acronyms and a whole lot of stuff and a whole lot of choices and perhaps even continued confusion for companies. What do you think about that, Chef Tim?
Well, it's a great question. As always, Elaine, you have the best questions. I think that this is a rapidly maturing market. And when I say rapidly, I mean, these things take time. I mentioned I've been at this a long, long time. But if we use the analogy of the financial disclosure market, it took many years before we had a consolidated, interoperable disclosure system under IFRS. And now we do. Most countries in the world use that. Most disclosures are, in fact, interoperable. The big four auditing firms know how the accounting was done, know how the disclosures are done, know how to assure those disclosures. That's what's happening here. I think, as I mentioned, I think the biggest difference is that with financial disclosure, we're talking about one thing. We're talking about money. And you can cut money many different ways, but it's still just money. With sustainability, and I see behind Esther, you have the 17 goals. We have many, many different issues, and they're as different can be. If we're talking climate change and we're talking labor conditions in the supply chain, they're very, very different. Now, how do you turn all of that into something that is auditable, assurable, and including the financial statements? What is happening is the first one through will be climate, and I don't think everything in the sustainability world is going to make it into the mainstream, and this is where the discussion and debate is right now. But I'm an optimist too, and I really actually see this mainstreaming of this first issue, which is climate change, into that mainstream of financial disclosure as just the first one. I think there will be more to come, and I think those mainstream ESG disclosures will become interoperable, will become international, will become comparable. And with all of those changes, we're going to see improvements. So to me, it's a very good thing.
Thank you. I think we just have time for one more quick question. We've got a question from Aditi Trivedi, who says, well, what about small enterprises? As sometimes, many small enterprises together, have a really significant impact. But are all of these changes, over the top of the heads of the SMEs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I hope we have a chance to answer the next one too, because it's very good. But the small and medium enterprises, I think, are always on our minds because they're the backbone of the economy, and many of these changes are in fact quite complex. And I hope that all the regulatory authorities, and I've heard they are making exceptions for small businesses in terms of ease of reporting. I know my own company, when we announced our $100 million fundraise recently, also is offering a free version of the software to help companies with the accounting problem. And I think that there'll be more sort of support for the small and medium enterprises across the world. Can we do that last one? It's really a good one.
Well, we are a bit behind schedule in our kitchen, and you know what happens when you overboil the rice. But still, very, very briefly, Tim, if you'd like to just take that. Should companies? So Ina Gill has asked, is there a need for companies to produce both a sustainability report and an integrated report? If they're doing an integrated one, do they need a sustainability one? Very quick
It's just such an
reaction to that.
important question because this audience is so familiar with the sustainability reporting, and that's why we're here. And I really do think that ultimately there's going to be a somewhat bifurcated future as companies start to work on these sort of integrated reports with climate change being in the financial statements. And I know some have already started doing that. There's still a need to disclose other things that companies are doing to protect people and the planet. Now, there's going to be a resource crunch, right? Because as the CFO and the C-suite get involved with financial disclosure, that's taking a lot of resources. And so there's a real question about how much is left to do the traditional sustainability reports. But in my view, they're very, very important and they should continue. So be on the lookout for that as you go into this new world.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim.